Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to lecture 13 in our series of lectures about grammatical rules and systems. This lecture will be the last lecture in which we cover new topics. The next lecture, lecture 14, will just be a review of some topics that we covered previously, and we will also give you sample questions of the exam so that you will have a good idea about the types of questions you can expect to see in the exam. But for now, we will cover a few new topics, and then we'll move on to lecture 14, and we will start our brief review. So in this lecture, we will talk about relative clauses and other subordinate clauses in continuation to our discussion of complex sentences and subordination. So in the previous lecture, lecture 12, we discussed subordination, and we said there are types of subordinate clauses, and we talked in detail about the first type, which is noun clauses. So in this lecture we'll cover other types, as we said, of subordinate clauses in more details. First we'll start with relative clauses. Relative clauses are clauses which merely modify a noun phrase. So their function is to modify noun phrases. They give us more information about the noun phrase. They let us know more about the noun phrase. They give us more detail about the noun phrase. So they are modifiers. This is the function of relative clauses. Relative clauses begin with a relative pronoun. So they begin with who, whom, whose, which, and that. And each one of those has a special use that we will talk about in a bit. So they are used specifically with certain noun phrases. But first let's look at an example of a relative clause. So in example 1 that we have here, the car which he owns is very old. The car which he owns is very old. Here the subordinate clause is which he owns. This subordinate clause is called a relative clause. Okay? It starts with the relative pronoun which. And its function is to modify the noun phrase the car. So now we know more about the car thanks to this relative clause. So when we say the car is very old, we don't know much about the car. Okay, so which car is this? Which car are we talking about? But when we say the car which he owns, or which Ahmed owns, or which Muhammad owns, we know now more about the car. So which he owns is a relative clause that modifies the noun phrase the car. Of course, we can separate the two clauses sometimes into two separate sentences. So the car which he owns is very old is basically two sentences, which is the car is very old and he owns the car. So this is an easy way to understand the different parts of information contained within a complex sentence. But it is not always possible. So sometimes it might be hard to separate a complex sentence into two sentences. But here in this case we did this by saying the car is very old, which is the main clause in example 1, and which he owns, this is the subordinate clause. We can say he owns the car. The person owns the car, so Ahmed or Muhammad or whatever owns the car. Sometimes the relative pronoun can be deleted. So instead of saying which or who or whom or whose, we can remove these pronouns. So the relative pronoun can be removed, and in this case we call this zero relative pronoun. So we don't have a relative pronoun in the subordinate clause, in the relative clause. But still it exists as a grammatical position, and it has a grammatical function. So for example, when we say the car he owns is very old, so this is similar to the previous sentence, but we removed the relative pronoun which. So instead of saying the car which he owns is very old, we said the car he owns is very old. We deleted and we removed the relative pronoun which. In this case, we still have a grammatical function for the relative pronoun. So in example 1, the relative pronoun which is the object of the verb owns. So the car which he owns is very old. The pronoun which is the object of the verb owns. And also in example 2, even though we don't have a relative pronoun, we still have what we call a zero relative pronoun. and it is the object of the verb owns, just like the relative pronoun which. So the zero relative pronoun, even though we can't see it, it still exists and still has a grammatical position in the clause. Alright, let's move on to talk about antecedents, okay, or the antecedent of the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun points back to the head. So it points back to the head. We said it modifies the noun phrase. So as we said previously, each noun phrase has a head. And each phrase has a head, of course. The noun phrase, the head that is modified by the relative pronoun, this is called the antecedent. Okay? So the relative pronoun points back to the head of the noun phrase modified by the relative clause. The head of the MP is called the antecedent of the relative pronoun. So let's take an example about this. The man who called us yesterday has come to meet you. So here we have the relative clause, who called us yesterday. The noun phrase, the man, has a head, which is man. So man is the head of the noun phrase, the man. Who called us yesterday? Here we have the relative pronoun who, and the antecedent of the relative pronoun who is man. So who points back to man. Okay, so the man who. So who points back. When you hear who called us yesterday, we are of course talking about the man. Okay, so when I ask you what is the antecedent of the relative pronoun who in this sentence, of course it is the head, it is man. This is the antecedent. So the man who called us yesterday has come to meet you. Here the pronoun who points back to the head of the MP, man. Man in this sentence is called an antecedent. Okay, so this is what we mean by an antecedent. It is the head of the noun phrase which the relative pronoun points to. Okay, so the relative pronoun points to the head. In this case, it is man in this sentence. Now, as we said, certain relative pronouns can be used with certain antecedents, with certain noun phrases. So, first of all, we will discuss personal relative pronouns, which are used with personal antecedents. If you remember, we talked a bit about personal and non-personal. We said that person, we can use it to talk about first, second, and third person. And there is also another use in which we say personal is used for humans, and non-personal is used for anything not human, like objects, like ideas, etc. So here certain pronouns are used with personal antecedents, which these pronouns are who and whom. So the personal relative pronouns who and whom are used with human antecedents. For example, there is a man outside who wants to see you. The relative pronoun here is who. The relative clause is who wants to see you, and it points to man, which is human. So who points to a human antecedent, which is man. So this sentence, of course, can be separated into two sentences, two simple sentences. There is a man outside, the man wants to see you. We combine them using a complex sentence. There is a man outside who wants to see you. We used a relative pronoun to form a complex sentence. Let's look at the second example. Ahmed who, or we can say Ahmed whom I told you about yesterday, is here. Here the relative clause is whom I told you about yesterday, or who I told you about yesterday. As we said, both are possible. We can use whom when the antecedent is actually an object. Okay, so to understand this, let's separate the sentence, the complex sentence, into two simple sentences. So Ahmed whom I told you about yesterday is here. We can say Ahmed is here. I told you about Ahmed yesterday. You will notice that in the second sentence, I told you about Ahmed. Ahmed in the second sentence is an object. Okay, so when we combine the two sentences to form a complex sentence, Ahmed is in the complex sentence is the subject, but because it was the object, when we separate the complex sentence into two sentences, we can use whom. But don't worry about it. If you find difficulty in using whom, usually who can be used instead. So we can say Ahmed, who I told you about yesterday, is here. No, there is no problem in using this. But there is, of course, another possibility. You should know that we can use whom if Ahmed takes the place of an object if we separate the two sentences. So Ahmed, whom I told you about yesterday, is here. So this is, of course, who and whom point to a personal relative pronoun. Ahmed, of course, is a human, so we used who or whom with Ahmed. Now we'll talk with another distinction, which are relative pronouns used with non-personal antecedents. We call these non-personal relative pronouns. The non-personal relative pronoun which, it is one pronoun, so instead we should modify the title. It should be non-personal relative pronoun, not pronouns, it's only one, which is which. So which is used to talk about animals, objects, places and ideas. As we said, anything not human. For example, I want a watch which is waterproof. The subordinate clause, the relative clause in this sentence is which is waterproof. So here we have which, this is the relative pronoun. It points to an antecedent, watch. You will notice that watch is not human, okay? It is an object. It is non-personal. So when we have a non-personal antecedent, we use which, okay? If you want to form a relative clause. So which is used with non-personal antecedents, like watch in this sentence. The third distinction is personal and non-personal relative pronouns. So here we can use these with both. We can use them with personal and we can use them with non-personal antecedents. These are that and whose. So the relative pronoun that and the relative pronoun whose can be used with both personal and non-personal antecedents. For example, there is the driver that was speeding. That was speeding is the relative clause. That is the relative pronoun, and we used it with a personal, a human antecedent, driver. Look at example 2. There is the car that was speeding. The relative clause is that was speeding. The relative pronoun is that, and it points to car, which is non-personal. It is not human. So car is an object, and we use that the same as we use it with a personal antecedent. So in the case of driver, driver is personal, we use that. And in the case of car, car is personal, we also use that. So that can be used with both personal and non-personal antecedents. Okay, now we'll talk about whose, the use of whose. Whose gives the idea of possession. So if we want to talk about possession, if we want to talk about a possession of the antecedent, we can use whose. So for example, the man whose car you borrowed wants to see you. So here we have the relative clause, whose car you borrowed. We have the antecedent man. The car belongs to man, okay? So whose car you borrowed. So the car belongs to man. This is why we use the relative pronoun whose, to give the idea of possession. So whose car you borrowed, this is the relative clause, and whose is a relative pronoun that gives the idea of possession. So if you separate this into two sentences, the man wants to see you, you borrowed his car. You notice his car, we used his, which is a possessive pronoun, if you remember. So here, if you want to combine the two sentences, we need to use whose. And whose can be used with both personal and non-personal. So we can use it with both human and, of course, objects, places, ideas, anything non-personal. So instead of saying the man, we can say the castle, and we use whose with it as well. So, for example, we saw the castle, whose walls. The walls belong to the castle. Okay, these are the castle's walls. So, whose walls were made of rocks. This is the relative clause. Whose is the relative pronoun, and it points to a non-personal antecedent, which is castle. So we saw the castle, its walls were made of rock. Its here refers, of course, to the castle, and this is also possessive. It is a possessive pronoun, its. Okay, now we will move on to talk about a different type of subordinate clauses. So we finished talking about relative clauses. In the following section, we will talk about the third type of subordinate clauses, which is adverbial. Okay, adverbial clauses. But first, let's look at this exercise. Which of the subordinate clauses in each of the following sentences is a relative clause? So here we have 5 sentences. Each one of them has a subordinate clause, and there are only a few of them that has, or a few of them that have a relative clause. Okay, so let's look at if there is a relative clause, you choose A. If there is no relative clause, you choose B. Let's look at number 1. The machine which makes plastic bottles is broken. Here the subordinate clause is which makes plastic bottles. So this is the subordinate clause in this sentence. Is it relative or not? What does it do in this sentence? If we look at it, it modifies machine. Now, thanks to this clause, we know more about machine. If we say the machine is broken, we don't know what kind of machine this is. But if we say the machine which makes plastic bottles is broken, in this case we know now more about machine. So it modifies machine, and in this case, as we said, clauses which modify a noun phrase are called relative clauses. So which makes plastic bottles is a relative clause. So we choose A. This is the correct choice in this sentence. Number 2, the manager is upset about what the worker told him. So where is the clause in this sentence? Where is the subordinate clause in this sentence? It is what the worker told him. Okay, so what the worker told him, this is the subordinate clause. So is it relative or not? What does it do in this sentence? Does it modify manager? Does it modify a noun phrase? Or for example here, manager, or anything else? So no, it doesn't. So it doesn't modify a noun phrase, and in this case we say no, it is not a relative clause. So the choice is B for number 2. Number 3, the problem is that he didn't oil the machine. So where is the subordinate clause in this sentence? That he didn't oil the machine. This is the subordinate clause. Is it relative or not? What does it do in this sentence? Does it modify a noun phrase? Does it modify a problem? No, it doesn't. So it is here the complement of the subject plus be. So the subject, the problem, and the verb to be is need a complement. So they both take this subordinate clause, that he didn't oil the machine. So it is not relative. It doesn't modify a noun phrase. So in this case, the correct choice is B, not a relative clause. Number 4, the worker that forgot to oil the machine is speaking with the manager. Where is the relative clause in this sentence, or where is the subordinate clause in this sentence? That forgot to oil the machine. This is the subordinate clause. Okay, is it relative or not? What does it do in this sentence? Again, it modifies worker. Now we know more about worker. So if we say the worker is speaking with the manager, we don't know which worker is speaking. Okay, we don't know more information about worker. But when we added this clause, this subordinate clause, that forgot to oil the machine, now we know more about worker. Now we know more information. We can understand what kind or which worker we're talking about. So that forgot to oil the machine, here this is a relative clause because it gives more information. It modifies worker. Okay, so this is a relative clause. So number 4, the correct choice is A. Number 5, they called a technician who could fix the machine. Where is the subordinate clause in this sentence? Who could fix the machine? Okay, so here we have the pronoun who, which is a subordinator, and we have the clause who could fix the machine, which functions as a modifier. It modifies technician. So it modifies technician. It gives us more information about technician. So it is relative. So they call the technician. Which technician? who could fix the machine. Okay, so this gives us more information about the technician. So in this case, number 5 is a relative clause as well. So the correct choice is A. Alright, now as we said, we move on to talk about adverbial clauses, which is one of the other types of subordinate clauses, the third type in fact. We talked first about, in the previous lecture, about noun clauses, then we talked earlier in this lecture about relative clauses. Now we move on to adverbial clauses, one of the types of subordinate clauses. These are similar to adverbs and adverb phrases, so they allow us to talk about time, place and manner, just like adverbs and adverb phrases which we discussed previously. So look at these examples. I met Ahmed in 2005. Here we have an adverbial phrase which is in 2005, and it gives us time. Okay, so this is a prepositional phrase. There's a preposition in, and of course prepositional phrase, it functions as an adverbial as we said, and it gives us time. Similarly, I met Ahmed when I was traveling. Here we have a clause, when I was traveling, and this is a subordinate clause, and it gives us an idea about time. So when did I meet Ahmed? When I was traveling. So we call this an adverbial clause of time. Okay, so this is an adverbial clause of time. It functions the same as adverbs and adverb phrases. Okay, let's look at another example. He parked his car here. So here we have an adverb of place, which is here. This is an adverb. We can also say he parked his car where there is a parking sign. So this subordinate clause gives us an idea about place as well. So where did he park his car? He parked it where there is a parking sign. So the place that has a parking sign. So this subordinate clause is also an adverbial clause of place. Another example, he drives carefully. Carefully gives us an idea about the manner. So how does this person drive? He drives carefully. So this is the manner of driving of the person. So we can say he drives as his father did. So his father drives carefully, and this person drives as his father did. So he also drives carefully. As his father did is a subordinate clause, and it is in this case an adverbial clause of manner. You will notice that the subordinator, the subordinate conjunction, is as in this case. So it is not a WH word like where or which, and it is not a that. So sometimes we have conjunctions, subordinate conjunctions different than that or where. In this case, as, and it gives us manner. So the words when, where and as in the previous sentences are all subordinate conjunctions. Okay, they introduce, they begin subordinate clauses. Please note that the title, there's a mistake in the title above here. So instead of relative clauses, please correct this. These are adverb clauses. Okay, I will try to correct it before I give it to you. So adverbial clauses, not relative clauses, as you see here. Alright, let's move on to another point. Adverbial clauses also have functions similar to adverbs and adverb phrases. So they are similar in function to adverbs and adverb phrases. We talked about the function of adverbials previously. So for example, the adverbial clause in the following sentence is an adjunct. So one of the functions of adverbials is that they are adjuncts. For example, I met Ahmed when I was traveling. We can say I met Ahmed and we end the sentence, but when we add when I was traveling, this is not really necessary, but it is optional. It is extra information. So where did I meet him, or when did I meet him? I met him when I was traveling. So this is an adjunct. It can be removed. It is not necessary for the completion of the meaning in this sentence. It is not necessary for the sentence to be grammatical, but it is used as a means of optional or extra information. So the function of the clause as a whole is adjunct. So clauses can also have functions similar to phrases that we discussed previously. So we can compare here. I met Ahmed in 2005. This is an adverbial phrase, and it is an adjunct, as we mentioned previously. Now we move on to the last section here, which is looking at some brief examples of other types of subordinate adverbial clauses. So here we will see just a few examples. We will not go too much into detail, just so you can get an idea about other different subordinate clauses. So in the first example, please return my book if you finish reading it. If you finish reading it, this is a subordinate clause. It is adverbial, and it gives us condition. Okay, and you will notice that the conjunction, the subordinate conjunction, is if. It is not that or who or which. It is if, and it gives us condition. So something conditional on something for something else. So please return my book. Returning the book depends on finishing reading it. Okay, so if the person has finished reading the book, he will return it. Otherwise, he will keep it. Okay, so this is a condition. So please return my book if you finish reading it. If you finish reading it is a subordinate clause. It is conditional. The next type, Ahmed is quicker than I am. Here we have a comparison clause. Okay, we are comparing two people. We are comparing Ahmed to the speaker. Okay, so Ahmed is quicker than I am. So than I am is a subordinate clause. The subordinate conjunction is than. So than functions here as a conjunction, a subordinate conjunction, and than I am is called a comparison clause. So we're comparing two things. We're comparing the Ahmed to the speaker. The next example, I couldn't open the door because I used the wrong key. Because I used the wrong key, this is called a reason clause. Okay, it is subordinate, of course, and there is a subordinate conjunction, because, and here this gives us the reason. Okay, so I couldn't open the door. Why wasn't the speaker able to open the door, or why couldn't the speaker open the door? Because he used the wrong key. Okay, so I couldn't open the door because I used the wrong key. This gives us the reason. The subordinate clause gives us the reason, and this is what we call reason clauses. The last example, he closed the window so that he wouldn't hear the noise outside. Okay, so this is purpose. Okay, so he stood up, he moved to the window, and he closed it. So why did he close the window? What is the purpose of this? Okay, so that the purpose, so that he wouldn't hear the noise outside. Okay, so he closed the window so that he wouldn't hear the noise outside. So that he wouldn't hear the noise outside is subordinate. It is a subordinate clause. The subordinator here is so that. Okay, so two words, they function as a conjunction. So that he wouldn't hear the noise outside is called a purpose clause. This was just a quick overview, just that you can see that not all subordinate clauses begin with who, which, or that. There are, of course, other examples than these that I mentioned. If you are interested, you can go to look at the references I gave you at the beginning of these lectures, and you can learn more about subordinate clauses. But this is enough for our purpose in this course, and this is the end of our topics in these lectures. As I said, in the next lecture it is just review, so the exam will be from lecture 1 to lecture 13. Lecture 14 is beneficial for you to look at just as a review. So after you study the lectures 1 to 13, you go and look at lecture 14 just to refresh your memory, to look at certain things that might be problematic to you. And sometimes you have students ask what is going to come in the exam, what types of question. So I will give you some sample questions so that you have a good idea about what to expect in the exam. So I will see you in the next lecture, inshallah. Thank you as always for listening.